Well, welcome to the next episode of Future Stack. My name is Jeff DeVerter, your host here, and our conversation and interview today is all about AI and AI compliance. Now, first out of the gate today is an article from Forbes. And this article talks about small and medium-sized companies and how they can make a huge impact in their organizations by utilizing AI. Now, the first way that they can do that is through personalized customer experiences. In fact, every industry and every size could utilize this. Now, here we talk about utilizing AI to analyze customer data and create tailored experiences for individual preferences to give people the experiences they want, even in these smaller companies. Large companies are already doing this, but AI makes it within reach for these smaller ones. Now, the second thing they talk about here is optimizing operations. Small businesses are so constrained by resources that they need to actually do this. It is a way that they can take so much of the busy work of the day-to-day of their organization off their shoulders. And lastly, enhancing marketing strategies. These are three important ways that AI is making a huge impact today, not only in those big businesses, but in small and medium-sized organizations. But as we know, AI comes with an awful lot of challenges. In fact, any technology does. Now, one of these challenges is highlighted in an article from Computer World, where they discuss the challenges and strategies for achieving compliance with generative AI. Now, compliance challenges. Gen AI systems, well, they often lack transparency, and they can produce unpredictable results and outputs, making it difficult to ensure compliance with regulators and with standards. How can companies even deal with that? Risk management is another challenge they highlight. Businesses should implement robust risk management practices, including regular audits and monitoring of AI systems to mitigate potential compliance issues. And then, of course, there are the ethical considerations. It's crucial to address ethical concerns by establishing clear guidelines and policies for the use of Gen AI, ensuring that AI-generated content aligns with ethical standards. Encouraging collaboration between compliance teams and AI developers, along with providing ongoing training, can help bridge the gap between technology and regulatory requirements. Now, to dig into this a little closer, I've invited an incredible guest to be a part of the program here today. His name is Walter Haydock. We've known each other for a few years now. He has an incredible company called StackAware.
Thanks a lot for having me on. Really appreciate you taking the time. So StackAware helps AI-powered companies measure and manage their cybersecurity, compliance, and privacy risk. So I've been in the security space for a while now, about 5 years on the technical side, and even longer than that on the policy side. I actually spent the early part of my career in the government, on Capitol Hill as a staffer, and then before that as a Marine Corps intelligence and reconnaissance officer. So in the end of 2022, obviously there was a huge explosion in interest in AI with the release of ChatGPT. I had spent a fair amount of time in self-study, determining which path I was going to take after leaving government service. I took my experience from government and moved into the cybersecurity space, and then spent a couple years working at different companies on application security, on data governance, and then decided to launch my own firm in 2022 after a bit of a focus on the vulnerability management problem, which is still near and dear to my heart. I decided that with the explosion in AI capabilities and products and features, that companies really needed an effective way to manage those risks. So StackAware pivoted into AI governance. And right now we're primarily focused on services. We are doing white glove engagements with customers who need to develop governance programs, to do risk assessments. And now increasingly, the ISO 42001 standard is coming into high demand. StackAware is going to be one of the first ISO 42001 certified companies out there. So we are ready to help others achieve that certification.
You know, since you bring up fancy things like, ISO 42001, why don't you define what that is for us real quick? Because it did come up in an article, which will be the subject of a lot of our conversation here today. But I think as a background, it'd be really helpful to, just what are the cliff notes on that?
ISO 42001 is the first certifiable AI governance standard globally. So the International Organization for Standards, they produce standards for all sorts of different things, from manufacturing to information security, the ISO 27001 standard. And recently, at the end of 2023, they released ISO 42001, which is the framework or the foundation for developing an AI management system. And essentially, this is a way to allow an external auditor to certify that you are managing AI risks in an effective and responsible manner.
Incredible. You can almost feel eyes rolling and, people getting tense when they hear about another standard, especially one that says, 42001. That sounds really hard. But in your article, and this is an article that can be found out on LinkedIn, I will comment and link it down below in the description. But in the article, you really are talking about how companies, when you get out and start even into a sales process, find that things get stalled, and not just sales process get stalled, but AI endeavors getting stalled. And you set out really a roadmap for that, a framework, if you will. And one of those things is to start with a framework. Now, why is a framework important in this context, especially with AI?
Whenever people are confronted with something new, they're going to look for a reference point to something that they know. So the frameworks that I proposed using were one, ISO 42001, because ISO is a well-known organization and they produce a lot of commonly accepted standards. And then the other one that I proposed building your program on is the NIST AI risk management framework. So the NIST cybersecurity framework has kind of become the bedrock for a lot of security programs, both in the United States and globally. And because the NIST AI RMF was a relative early mover in terms of its release, it came out in early 2023. I think that it is going to form the foundation for a lot of AI governance programs. With that said, all the NIST standards cannot be certified against for private sector organizations. So they're mandatory for the U.S. government, but they cannot be certified against. So there's no way you can get someone to give you a certificate saying that you are abiding by the requirements of the NIST AI RMF. That's why 42001 fills a gap, because it gives you evidence that someone else has attested to your program.
And all of this, of course, driving towards AI governance. Why is AI governance, why is it important for an organization or an enterprise? And why are they struggling with dealing with governance inside of their organizations?
So governance from an immediate perspective is important for things like cybersecurity, compliance, and privacy. There are a whole host of new potential attack vectors opened up through artificial intelligence, whether they're just accidental things like unintended training, potentially feeding sensitive information to third-party models that then learn from that information and are able to reproduce it. That's a potential cybersecurity threat. Yeah. On the compliance side, there are standards or there are laws like the EU AI Act, which recently came into force in Europe. States like Colorado have enacted their own artificial intelligence bills. So there's increasing scrutiny from governments and regulators. And then on the privacy side, there are a lot of things that are getting quite blurry with artificial intelligence. So, for example, the ability to redact personal data becomes much more difficult. So if you have a standard deterministic system with a database and you receive for example, a right to be forgotten request under the EU GDPR, you could just simply delete the data, assuming that you have the technical capability and you don't have any shadow data. You could just delete that data to meet the requirements of that law. Now, with artificial intelligence, especially generative AI tools, it's possible that you could have a model that produces sensitive information about someone without ever actually having been exposed to it. So some researchers showed that you could use commonly available large language models to infer lots of information about people based on things that they were saying. For example, using very idiosyncratic terms to describe like traffic stops would allow someone using a large language model to identify, where you were born or where you were raised or where you're currently living. So it gets a lot trickier with AI because you can't simply delete the personal information. you may need to do things like machine unlearning on the model to prevent it from reproducing that information. And that's still kind of a gray area, whether that's effective enough and if that's going to be viable from a business perspective.
All right, so you got a company that's figured out, that governance is important. They're going to create that. They realize that having a model or a framework that they can tie that to is important. How do they go about marrying those two things together? A governance plan tied to one of these, whether it's NIST or whether it's the ISO model.
So a governance framework is the foundation for your program, and it should work in concert with any other existing standards that you have. So if you are pursuing ISO 42001 and you are already ISO 27001 certified, that's going to be one of the easier moves that you need to make, because you'll need to integrate things like an AI policy. You'll need to have AI risk and impact assessments, but the same general framework is there. Now, if there are other standards that you're currently abiding by or have attestations for, like SOC 2 or High Trust, there's definitely no conflict there, but it might be a more challenging route to get to ISO 42001 certification.
Now, once you choose, you get your model figured out, you get the governance in place, you choose a model, you got to train that model on your data. And let's talk about differences maybe, or where it may be more important if we're talking about training on B2C, so business to consumer or business to business. Any impact one way or the other there?
This may seem like news to a lot of people, but basically all your vendors are training AI on your data. So they're using predictive AI, they're processing telemetry, they're identifying, okay, users click on this icon versus that icon more frequently. So that's been going on for a very long time. And, there's certainly something to be said for drilling into that and identifying exactly what sort of information that vendors are pulling out of telemetry. But the biggest concern has been more on the generative AI side. So in these situations, it's possible to reproduce detailed data that could mimic or reproduce some of the information from the content that the customer is providing to the vendor. So there's a lot more focus on the generative AI training. I would say it's kind of a spectrum. There are no absolutes in cybersecurity and AI governance. It's all gray. But understanding exactly how a vendor is training on your data, what data they're training on, what the ownership of the resulting model is, these are all important things that enterprises should work out in their contracts with their vendors. Being explicit about it prevents any sort of misunderstanding or even potential data breach.
So let's talk best practices here about companies who are implementing AI to make their company better, faster, more efficient, more advantageous against their competitors. So what are some strategies that they can use in helping ensure a good strategy for communicating with customers about how their data may be used?
Yeah, so being transparent, I think, is a really important aspect of having a good relationship with your customers, whether they're B2B, like I described just previously, or in B2C situations. Those consumers are not going to be negotiating individual contracts with their vendors. Some might, or a very small portion would be doing that. But they're going to look to influencers, to privacy experts, things like that, to signal to them when something is kind of out of the norm or violating commonly accepted practices. Additionally, the Federal Trade Commission earlier this year warned that retroactively changing or stealthily changing terms and conditions without alerting users to allow for AI training could potentially constitute an unfair or deceptive trade practice. So being transparent about exactly what you're doing is very important.
So one of the other things you mentioned is the AI bill of materials and why it's important. So let's talk about that a little bit. Why has that become a thing? I first started following a few years ago. It was the SBOM. It was what's called all part of the security side. So now AI bill of materials, the AI bomb. So what's in there?
Yeah, so an AI bill of materials is really just a type of software bill of materials or just a type of bill of materials.
Right.
And including in your comprehensive tracking of all your software and hardware assets, if you want to go that far, including the AI training, the processing, and the data collection that's going on, that can help you address a lot of issues at once. So from a communications perspective, you can very readily explain to your customers exactly how you're using AI in your supply chain. on the communication side as well. So StackAware makes our software bill of materials, which includes an AI bill of materials, publicly available. So if anyone ever has any question about what tools we are using and what data we're processing, you can just take a look at that and ask your questions if you have any about what we're doing, and we're happy to be clear and transparent about how we're using AI. And then on the compliance side of things, like you described, the EU AI Act will require de facto the inventory of your AI systems. So you need to understand exactly which tools that you are using will qualify under the Act to be able to comply with it. And that's going to be the case with a lot of other standards as well.
Well, I hope you enjoyed this episode. And if you enjoyed that conversation with Walter, well, first of all, go check out his content, but also subscribe to the podcast where you'll find all of the audio from my conversation with Walter. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to this channel where we're publishing content every week. We'll see you next week on FeatureStack.